Thank you very much for having me. I wasn't expecting to do this talk. I'm giving you the same talk that I did recently to a NZIIA group. Those of you who know a lot about China may find this a little bit basic. And what I do is tear through, 5,000 years or so of history in about 20 minutes in an attempt to make sense of where we are today. So forgive me if some of it seems like a crude summary of some very complicated things. Other thing I should say, I've been in New Zealand about 3 weeks now, and I was just in Wellington, and I gave a talk to a group, a very different kind of talk, more about the relationship with the United States, the three-way, the horrible triangle New Zealand is one corner of. And I've realized it's very tough to talk about China right now in New Zealand, because on the one hand I think there's a lot of complacency here about the dangers and the threats that China presents to New Zealand, the possibilities of things going really wrong. And on the other hand, you're starting to also see the kind of fear-mongering in New Zealand about China that that is a big problem in the United States. And so I'm trying to walk a fairly difficult line between those two things, and I'm going to err on one side and the other, so forgive me for that. I'm trying to make sense of how we think about China at this moment. What does it mean in a post-pandemic world? Why does it behave the way it behaves? I see the slide has got slightly that U is supposed to be Ukraine. Is China a totalitarian threat? Is New Zealand too dependent on exports to China? And I can answer that one. I think yes. The neighborhood. One thing that I find in the United States particularly is not very well understood is how different just the geography of China makes it from the United States, because people tend to think they're both big continental countries, lots of people, big economies. But the United States has got Mexico and Canada as its neighbors, and they're both quite sweet, friendly countries. It's a bit like New Zealand, there's nobody around to threaten you really. But China has a really horrible neighborhood, 14 land borders. And so the countries are Mongolia, which at one point invaded and controlled China. Russia, with there's a great friendship, so-called friendship now between Russia and China, but they've been at war and they don't trust each other. India, where even now there's ongoing border skirmishes. You have Southeast Asia, you have Vietnam. China and Vietnam don't get on very well. And then you have all the stands, which is one of the most unstable areas of the world. There's even a tiny bit of Afghanistan that borders on China. And then, of course, you have the Koreas and Japan, and the Koreas and Japan and China also have had a history of much less than friendly relationships. So, when you think about China and why it behaves the way it does, often I think, you've got to bear in mind that they're surrounded by hostile forces in a way that many countries aren't. The topography, the geography of China itself inside the country is also something worth thinking about. So that shows the elevation, and most of China is dry, semi or desert and very mountainous, very inhospitable to people. You can see the same thing reflected in the rainfall. The red and orange bits are very, very dry. There's a demographer called Hu Huayong in 1935 proposed this line called the Heihe Tengchong line. So Heihe is that town in the northeast, and then Tengchong is this town down in Yunnan in the southwest. And most of the people live in the orange bit. So when he proposed the line, that was on the left, on the western side, the yellow was 64% of the area with 4% of the population. And the last figure I saw that looked at this line, it was 57% of the area. Obviously, the borders of the country have changed since 1935. Are only 6% of the population. So, you think of China as a big country, but most of the people are jammed into, this tiny little bit of it, really. And I felt this myself. These are some photos. I did this long bike trip from Peshawar on the border of Afghanistan into Xinjiang and then Qinghai and Tibet. And this is what most of the country looks like. There's just no people. It's mountains, it's desert, miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. Not a good idea to ride it on a bicycle, I have to tell you. The other thing about China is, aside from the fact that most of the people are jammed into a fairly small part of it, it's incredibly diverse. One often thinks of China as a kind of homogeneous country where people, look the same, and you think of China as being a kind of a country that where everything is kind of evenly distributed, and nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at GDP, you can basically see almost all of the money is in. Let me just stand up because I don't think this colors make it clear. Basically, all of the money is here. You can see Beijing has a very high GDP because it's the corrupt capital, where where money changes hands. But most of the actual industry is on the coast, and the rest of China is still very poor. And rich China is crazy rich now, but there are still plenty of people who are very, very poor. Now, the country has officially eliminated poverty. But it's a very, very low definition. Much of Western China, people are living in, by Kiwi standards, very, very, very poor conditions. They might not be hungry, but it's just about that. It's also very culturally and linguistically diverse. So even if you're just thinking of Chinese languages themselves, Mandarin is roughly, Northern Chinese, the Beijing dialect, and that's the official language. But there are literally hundreds of dialects, and they're only called dialects because some of them don't have their own armies. Cantonese is the most famous one, and it's mutually unintelligible with Mandarin. Beijingers can't understand Shanghainese, they can't understand Hokkien, they can't understand Fujianese. And in places like in the southeast on the coast, provinces like Fujian, there are areas where, from one village to another, the dialects dramatically vary. So this is a very tough country to stereotype, and it's also a very tough country to rule, because all of these people, have different ways of thinking. And I didn't even mention, as you can see, Mongolian, Uyghur, Tibetan, Korean. There's plenty of other ethnic groups aside from the Han Chinese, who's the people that we typically think of as Chinese. They are 80 to 90% of the population, but there are plenty of other ethnic groups. Food. You're lucky enough in Auckland to have actually quite a good variety of Chinese food. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, where we don't have a good variety of Chinese food. But even aside from the minority ethnic groups, Tibetans and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, everywhere you go in China has its own cuisine, and it's one of the wonderful things about the country. And I used to say when I lived in China for 20 years. From 1995 to 2015, and whenever I was unhappy about it, I would go out and eat. So now here is my quick kind of dummy's guide to Chinese history that is going to probably annoy some of you because it's just too crude, but I'm going to try and get through in 10 minutes several thousand years. So the sort of cliche is China has 5,000 years of history, and you hear that in official Chinese pronouncements all the time, and it's kind of, you could make a case for it, but 2,000 years is really more realistic if you think of China as a country. And we typically think of China as starting with Emperor Qin, whose name is probably why we call it China, Qin Shi Huang. It literally means Qin, the first emperor. And he unified a fairly large chunk of land. He's the guy whose tomb has the terracotta warriors in Xi'an. He was a ruthless leader. One of his famous acts was burying all the scholars and burning all the books. But he was responsible for unifying the country and sort of making it, starting it as a unit, but it wasn't that big. This is, I don't know if that might make sense to you, but this is a small part of China. It obviously doesn't include Taiwan, which It's just this bit. Taiwan's down there. So, large parts of what is today southern China weren't part of China back then. So sometimes when you hear the Chinese government say, this has been part of China since blah, 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 5,000 years, it's often not really the case. I'm just giving a quick dose of a few select dynasties just to try and give a kind of picture. The Song dynasty is one of the most remarkable dynasties of China, and for many Chinese people, in some ways, it represents like the real essence of Chinese culture. That I wasn't able to make it animated. That scroll painting is the Qingming River, Qingming Shanghe Tu, the Qingming River Scrolls, this long piece of artwork, which has been copied several times. And you're lucky enough in Auckland right now, there's an exhibition, and I think it's called the Vodacom Center, an interactive exhibition of this artwork. And I'd really encourage you to go and see it if you haven't already, if you're interested in China. And it's representative of a real high point culturally. And some of the things that happened in the Song Dynasty, the government funded schools and temples and social services, including post and retirement homes, remarkably enough. For this is a long time ago, the year 960 to 1279. Public clinics, public hospitals, which we still don't have in America, really. That was the extent of the Song Dynasty. It was bigger than the Qing Dynasty, but as you can see, it didn't include Tibet, didn't include Xinjiang, didn't include parts of China that the Chinese government says have been part of China since time immemorial. The Tang Dynasty is another high point, and also one of the dynasties that many Chinese people feel was a really great point in the country's history. It was a very open time. The country was run by multi-ethnic bureaucrats. Foreign religions were encouraged and came in, like Buddhism. This is the extent of it. You can see it went much further west. Didn't really include Tibet, but it included large parts of Xinjiang. It's I guess best thought of as a very maybe the most cosmopolitan time in Chinese history. And then it was not too long afterwards, you had what in China is called the Yuan Dynasty, which is when China was part of the Mongol Empire. And this, in fact, so when foreigners were running China, it was at its greatest extent. And depending on exactly how you read history, the Mongol Empire at one point, extended as far as Hungary, essentially. And it was, in some ways, a very brutal regime, but they also did a lot of things. It encouraged trade. There was no restrictions on foreign religions. The picture there is from a recent Netflix. It's not an actual picture. It's a recent Netflix show about the Mongolian Empire. So that's the extent of the empire as it's known in China, the Yuan Dynasty. Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, we're getting close to modern time. This is when most of the Great Wall, as we think of the Great Wall, was built. The first fortifications were built by Emperor Qin, but they were mud brick fortifications that don't look like the crenellated Great Wall that you think of. And the Great Wall is not one wall, and it doesn't go, from Gansu province all the way to the coast in one straight line, and you can't see it from the moon. It's bits and pieces of fortifications, and most of the ones that look like this are, around Beijing essentially, and the most beautiful bits are around Beijing. That was the extent of the Ming dynasty. Again, didn't include Tibet, didn't include most of Xinjiang. Now, the next dynasty was the Qing Dynasty, and that was the final dynasty of Imperial China. And this basically was when the contemporary borders of China were established, and so including Tibet and Xinjiang. The Qing were not Han Chinese, they were Manchurians, and in fact, Beijing was an apartheid city under the Manchurians. Again, something if you go to the Forbidden City in Beijing, they don't make this very clear in any of their signage. If you were Han Chinese, you weren't really allowed into the the center of the city, not just the Forbidden City, but the bits around it, unless you had some kind of special job. You had to be Manchurian. The Manchurians also imposed the queue on Chinese men, the pigtail and the funny shaved hairstyle, which was resented by Han Chinese people. It lasted from 1644 to 1912, and towards its end it became very, very closed, and it very resistant, a corrupt, closed empire. So closed, it didn't, want to have any truck with foreigners, and Britain's first engagement with it, they were buying tea, and they liked tea. And China didn't actually want anything from them. Famously, Lord Macartney, on behalf of King George III, went to China to basically try and open up trade relations. And the Qianlong Emperor said, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." Well, the Brits didn't like this, of course. So hence the Opium War. Sorry, I've got this slide. The Opium War, and famously the sacking of the Summer Palace. The British thought, well, if you're not going to trade with us, we're going to force you. And they did it by, what is today sometimes called gunboat diplomacy, essentially beating China into submission. One of the most bitter memories in China is of the sacking of the Summer Palace in 1860. And this is part of what in China is referred to as the 100 Years of Humiliation. And with complete justification, this was when Hong Kong became an outpost of the British Empire. This was when Shanghai and other ports began to be run by foreigners who insisted on extraterritoriality, which meant they could commit any kinds of crimes and brutal treatment of Chinese people without any consequences. It's perfectly justifiable for the Chinese to feel resentment about this period of history. Unfortunately, the Communist Party has also made it part of the raison d'etre and part of the education, a very strong part of the education system, and it has been propagandized with great effectiveness. So it's not that it's not justifiable, but it's a wound that the Communist Party keeps on rubbing salt in because it helps to justify their own rule. The Qing Dynasty ended in 1912, and Imperial China was over. But most of what happened for the ensuing decades was, foreign domination, chaos. The Japanese actually invaded and set up a puppet state in northeastern China. It was a very unhappy time to be Chinese. And so the Communist Party came along. 1949 took over, Chairman Mao, and in the way it's referred to in China, liberated China. The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, the army, which is the army of the Communist Party, took over. October 1 is the official date that it's commemorated on as China's national day and the founding of modern China. So Chairman Mao ruled from 1949 until his death in 1976, and that also marked the end, famously, of the Cultural Revolution. He was followed, his successor was Deng Xiaoping. There was, in fact, a little-known interregnum with a guy named Hua Guofeng who ruled for just a little while, but basically Deng Xiaoping took over in 1978 and famously introduced the reform and opening up policies, which have led to the China that we know of today, opened up the economy, and there was a great degree of political opening up too, but within limits. After, one of the things that Deng did was he established a system of rule by some kind of consensus of the senior leaders of the Communist Party. The idea was to stop the possibility of having another Chairman Mao. And one of the things that was included in this New Deal for China was term limits, essentially. 2 terms for the president, who has been also the chairman of the Communist Party, which is really the more important title, and also the chairman of the top military guy. So Deng was followed by Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao. And that worked very nicely in terms of the economic growth from the 90s when I went to China until 2012 when Xi Jinping took over. And now things are looking a little bit different because one of the things Xi Jinping has done is abolish the term limits. There's Chairman Xi's official photo. The way I typically refer to him is the chairman of everything, which is a phrase coined by the sinologist Jeremy Goldkorn, who I actually saw he lives in New Zealand now, just outside of Wellington. And he is the chairman of everything because soon after he took over, he basically put himself in charge of everything important. And he did this by establishing these small leading groups that I will get into in just a moment. So let's start with document number 9. This came out, it was leaked in, I think 2012. It was one of the early leaks out of Chairman Xi's rule. It was a document circulated amongst party members and then to institutions such as universities. The official name was a communique on the current state of the ideological sphere. What it essentially set out was the idea that China needs to go back to communist ideology, that it needs to stop Western influences, and this applied, across society, universities, and politics. Another thing that was leaked was a speech that Chairman Xi gave that in some ways I think gives you an idea of what he fears the most. And he talked about the fall of the Soviet Union. And he said, 戈尔巴乔夫轻轻一句话宣布苏联共产党解散. So Gorbachev said likely said one sentence and the Soviet Union was dissolved. 偌大一个党就没了. This great party was suddenly nothing. 最后进入一人是男儿，没什么人出来抗争. So nobody was man enough to stop this. Nobody came out to protest. And I think of this as key to understanding what drives Xi Jinping, because it's got a lot in it. It's the fear of the dissolution of a great country, which Chinese leaders have always feared. But it's the fear of the end of a communist party as well. And it's the idea that the Communist Party is the true and just ruler of China, and it should do everything it can to stay that way. It's also got this machismo that I think is fairly typical of Xi Jinping. Nobody was man enough, and being manly is a feature of Xi's rule that is quite important because he's done various things like. Under his rule, there've been a campaign to stop sissy boys, as they call it, so no more like K-pop style kind of effeminate men in pop music and this kind of thing. And this seems very much a part of who Xi is. One of the other signature parts of his rule has been an anti-corruption campaign, and this has actually been enormously popular in China. And it is certainly true that under Hu Jintao and then previously under Jiang Zemin, as the economy was expanding, there was corruption on an enormous scale, and it was so kind of naked and obvious to anyone living in China. I mean, I was in Beijing for most of that time, and you'd see these guys usually in black Audis or smarter cars who had government plates, didn't ever have to obey the traffic rules. You'd go to nightclubs and just see people who you just look nakedly corrupt, spending money wildly. There's a book that came out recently by a fellow named Desmond Shum called, I'm blanking on the title. he describes basically he was a businessman who took advantage of this, and it's worth reading. He comes off as a very horrible individual, but the book is worth reading if you want to get a sense of how corrupt it was. And his wife was the fixer for Wen Jiabao, the previous premier's family. So quite a scandalous book. Obviously not available in China. Small leading groups I mentioned. This was the way that Xi Jinping basically took control of the government in his early days. The concept is an old sort of communist idea. A small leading group of the party will be a group that gets together and they will have various responsibilities in the government, because there's a separation between the party and the government. But the people in the small leading group will figure out, what the correct policies or campaigns that need to happen are. And then they will go ahead and execute them in their formal roles in the government. So Xi Jinping established a small leading groups, for example, for the internet. And through this, then was able to basically unify internet policy across the many different government agencies that had previously, presented like a patchwork of different regulators that had allowed for a lot more flexibility within the system. And my time in China, I ran a website and a consulting firm, a research firm, that enjoyed the benefits of this flexibility of systems, because I was allowed to operate a website essentially uncensored, right out of Beijing, with nobody really minding, and something that just wouldn't be possible today. Another thing closely identified with Xi Jinping is the Belt and Road Initiative. So this seems almost like a slogan that Xi Jinping came up with when he was in Kazakhstan in 2014, and then rapidly became this enormous global infrastructure project. There's a lot of the time it seems that Belt and Road is just a label that's attached to like any global project that China is doing. But there is a bit more coherence than that. And I mean, the idea really is that China wants to develop a network of infrastructure and transport links that will facilitate trade globally. And it started, the initial map of it you can see was basically land links to Europe and then sea links via Africa also to Europe. But it's now been extended to really be include the South Pacific, include South America. The funny thing about the Belt and Road is that the road is the maritime road and the belt is the Silk Belt. So it's kind of a kooky name. I wish they'd just called it the New Silk Road. It would have been sort of made much more sense. But Belt and Road is what it is, and the road is in the sea. The 9-dash line in the South China Sea, yet another important thing that happened. Xi Jinping, when he met Obama in 2013, gave assurances that he would not be militarizing the South China Sea islands. But indeed, he has gone ahead and done that. If you follow the news, there's all kinds of military installations and on these tiny bits of rock poking out of the South China Sea. This thing is this 9-dash line, sometimes called the cow's tongue. China claims all of this as its own ocean, and you can see it goes very, very close to other countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and it's very, very far away from China, and it looks kind of ridiculous, especially when presented on a map like this. And it looks pretty ridiculous presented on maps, like for example, when I did that bike trip in 96 in Kashgar. If you bought a city map of Kashgar, it would also have a map of China to show you where Kashgar was in relation to China. And that map had to have the 9-dash line on it. So, the map of China in the corner of the map had to be so much bigger. And you're not allowed to print a map of China without this 9-dash line in China. Why are they so worried about this? Why do they want this so badly? There's lots of reasons, obviously, but I think it comes down to seeing the fact that China has been invaded from the sea. That's where it suffered the most. Is the 100 years of humiliation. The foreign barbarians came through that piece of the sea. But of course, there's other reasons. Resources, fish, oil. I'm getting to the end. The frontier. Another thing that we've seen under Xi Jinping is a real crackdown on the frontier regions. Tibet has always been a place that has been severely repressed because it has a minority that has, an exiled leader and globally famous and vocal and very well organized. Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs, who are a Muslim group of 10 million people or so, not huge, in the past wasn't the subject of such fierce crackdowns, but worries about terrorism, some of them, one could say justified, because there were a lot of attacks between 2009 and about 2014, very amateur attacks, but the China is terrified of problems in its vast western region, and as a result has a very brutal policy on the Uyghurs. There are these internment camps where many of them have been kept, which the Chinese government euphemistically calls re-education camps. And it really does seem an attempt to destroy the will of the Uyghurs to have any kind of independent thinking. Hong Kong obviously has also been the subject of severe crackdowns following the protests, and it's now become really just another Chinese city. In 2020 there was a national security law which was introduced that is basically allows the Chinese government to restrict free speech and independent political activity in much the same way it does in the mainland. Taiwan obviously still retains its independence, but for how much longer? Xi has also launched a common prosperity campaign, an idea to try and equalize the very real inequities of that have developed over the last 20, 30 years, and this has involved cracking down on big tech companies. Famously, this guy is Jack Ma, Alibaba head, one of the richest men in the world. There's a lot of what they're doing actually seems quite justifiable. They're, for example, one rule is to stop, to regulate algorithms, to stop internet companies basically corrupting the youth by, social media like TikTok, but also to stop internet companies from offering different prices to people, figuring out who can pay more and this kind of thing. Some kind of rules that we probably could do with a bit more in the West. And last thing I'd say, COVID-0 is perhaps the most recent strong association with Xi Jinping, and we still don't really know where this is going. But I hear a lot of grumbling about Jacinda in New Zealand and the lockdowns. But I mean, you didn't want to be in Shanghai in the last few months and get locked into your apartment for 2 straight months with not enough food. Priority under Xi Jinping: global respect, getting strong, shaping the international system, discourse power, getting people to speak with more respect about China, essentially. Financial and technological independence. They don't want to have to buy chips from the West, silicon chips. Military strength, territorial integrity. New Zealand, finally, I get there and I'm nearly done. So China is New Zealand's largest trading partner. Alistair, correct me if I'm wrong, but two-way trade exceeded 1 billion New Zealand dollars in 2021. Exports were at 20.1 billion. You know what is exported, I don't have to tell you. I think you've got to be careful. And just recent history, in 2005, 10, 2012, there were standoffs over the disputed Senkaku Islands, or Diaoyu Islands in Chinese, and led to various trade boycotts, often not announced, but imposed by customs authorities, including in 2010, China refusing to send any rare earths to Japan. Norway had similar treatment. Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a dissident in 2010, and even though the Nobel Committee isn't the Norwegian government, the relations were basically frozen for 10 years. Salmon Norwegian salmon ceased to be available in China. There was a similar thing happened with South Korea. The Americans put in this new THAAD missile system in 2017, and Korean businesses had a horrible time in China. Performances by musicians were cancelled. The Lotte supermarket chain suddenly found that they weren't allowed to operate, or there were restrictions. Australia, similar treatment. It's still huge tariffs on Australian wine after Scott Morrison made some remarks about investigating the COVID origins in 2020. And there's been some research done on the Dalai Lama trade effect. Basically, if the Dalai Lama visits your country, trade with China is going to go down. So despite all the stuff I've said, I think New Zealand should continue to trade and maintain good relations with China. And I don't think New Zealand should be in the business of, if I may use an Antipodean word, shirt fronting, like Scott Morrison did. There's a lot of problems in China. It's not going to go away. It's an enormously important country. It's not just the Communist Party. Part of my spiel at the beginning about the diversity of the place is that, this is a country of ordinary people, just like Kiwis. It's not possible for New Zealand to end its dependency on China. So I think that going forward, the wisest course is to try to maintain as smooth as possible relations with China. But I do think that New Zealand has to figure out what its values are, and it shouldn't always just say nice things, to please Xi Jinping. This is a democracy. People are you're going to have somebody who's going to offend Beijing at some point, whether it's a leader in power or an opposition leader or a civil society group. And I think New Zealand has to figure out what it's willing to stand up for, and it has to be prepared for the day when somebody says something very rude and suddenly no more lamb, no more mutton to China. That's it. I'm very easy to find on the internet, and I'm going to end there.
All right.
Sorry, that was a little too quick. Too much too quick.
Fantastic. So I think I now go straight into my part, so I get to take my mask off. So I'm Alistair Crozier, and I'm Executive Director at the New Zealand China Council. Just before I start my response to Jeremy and open up for questions, I'd just like to acknowledge the awful news out of Japan in the last 24 hours. I think when we're sitting here talking about these foreign policy issues, at the end of the day it all comes down to individuals, and when you lose someone like former Prime Minister Abe, it's devastating. Anyway, on to something happier. Really privileged to be sitting alongside Jeremy Goldkorn today. I don't know how many of you are China watchers or China hands, but for those of us who try to understand China, as a friend said to me the other day, Jeremy's something of a rock star in terms of his SupChina and Sinica Podcast platforms. Your latest email popped into my inbox this morning when I was preparing to come here. So really fantastic to have an opportunity just to mine Jeremy's really rich knowledge of contemporary China, but also, as we've just seen, also China's history as well. So as discussant, I thought I would speak for as little time as possible, partly because I'm also on a flight at 3 o'clock this afternoon, but also to give as much time as I can to everyone for Q&A. But just some of the highlights for me from what Jeremy said that I took away from the presentation. Firstly, I think Jeremy really captured the very complex diversity of what is China. There's a lot of talk about China this and China that, and New Zealand engaging with China, but really, what is China? Is it the Communist Party that we're engaging with? Is it the government? Is it the middle class that are developing rapidly, they've got more spending power than ever before, they're busy and they're worried about their kids' future, but they're fundamentally healthy and well-fed and at least until COVID, travelling internationally? Are we talking about a Tibetan subsistence farmer or a Uyghur over in Xinjiang or someone up in the northeast? It's an incredibly contrasting country. I have lived in Beijing and also in the west of China in Sichuan, and it's almost like dealing with the EU in a sense, but it's one country. And I know that's very simplistic, but just that contrast in languages, as you said, Jeremy, and cultures and levels of development. If we think we know one China, it's multiple Chinas. The other point that I think came out very strongly that still resonates really, really strongly in China today is obviously its history. And I think more than anywhere else I've lived, China, its leaders and its people do look backwards thousands of years into its history and draw lessons from that they then bring up into the future today. And so of course when you see now China very determined on emerging as a stronger power and its people being prosperous and wealthy. The hurt of those periods you mentioned, Jeremy, the unequal treaties and that feeling of being dominated by outside powers is very, very strong, and I think it's really burns deep in the heart of the people that are running the country today. Just in terms of, I guess, President Xi and his motivations, I've drunk a little bit more Kool-Aid than Jeremy, I think, possibly in terms of why I think the party is determined to stay in power. I don't think that's for its own end. I think they genuinely do want to see their people prosper, and I think they genuinely believe that they are the only way really that can be done. And I think when you look at some of their actions, such as the Belt and Road, I think part of it is to secure supply lines and to secure channels to ensure that they have the resources that they need to continue advancing their country. Because as Jeremy very clearly pointed out, there's large parts of the country that don't have much. And so I sometimes feel in the New Zealand media there's a sense of a sort of large threatening nation, but I personally believe that they are focused back in on themselves and they want a better China for themselves. New Zealand, I think Jeremy's last point was absolutely valid. We have to continue to engage because we really have no other option. China is going to be there for a long time to come. Although it's hard, I fully agree with Jeremy, we've just got to find a way through. We have no alternative. I think it is a balancing act at the moment. I think those of you who have followed engagement over the last few months have seen, I think New Zealand's genuinely trying to find a way through. We've said things like, we're not interested in formal military alliances. That's not our game. But we also have our values, and we have made statements. Our government, Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs have made statements in recent months on Hong Kong and on human rights issues. Trying to do that in a New Zealand way, I think, is something that sets us aside from maybe some larger or some little powers. And we just have to keep doing that. The one point I would like to go into in a little bit of detail is something that our council has just done some research on, which is this idea of, are we too exposed to China economically? Your data were all correct. It's a large trading relationship. Last year, 32% of New Zealand's goods exports went to China from our global total. So that is a big percentage, but it's not the biggest. Australia is closer to 40%, and so is a country like Chile, for example. And in fact, I think it's well over 120 countries now have China as their largest trading partner. So this is not a unique thing that we face. I guess the research that we did concluded that some of our companies are 100% exposed to the China market. Our crayfish exporters, they have no other market. So if things really go pear-shaped, they've lost their entire export business. Others are a lot more diversified. But the lesson I think to take away from Australia is that even in the darkest hours when they were really getting clobbered with economic coercive measures, trade still expanded. And so some products such as wine were hit very hard, others such as wool and iron ore were allowed to continue. And so our research that we commissioned concluded that that was largely due to the fact that China couldn't get those things from anywhere else. And so the products that are most at risk are the ones where they can get them from a number of other source countries. And if you happen to be a New Zealand company exporting that in large quantities to China, then yes, you could be hit. But in fact, there's a lot of our other lines that are likely to continue, even if the going gets tough. So yes, I guess that's that final point, is that our trade is not some big monolithic thing that's just going to completely fall off.
So Australia, actually, don't worry about it. Too dependent on Australia, it sounds like to me.
It's not going to fall off the cliff in one huge lump, but absolutely take Jeremy's point that we have seen a history of countries being targeted by measures when they fall foul of China. And we hope that doesn't happen to us. So look, they were my brief comments in response, but as I said, this is an invaluable opportunity to plumb Jeremy's deep knowledge on either contemporary China or I guess China in the past, and I'd love to open it up to the floor to anyone who's got a question.
I've got a question I've been dying to ask. So I'm reading a book called The Digital Silk Road.
Mm-hmm.
And it describes how China's built an internet which is essentially insulated from the rest of the world, and they do that because they want to control the content and also the technical means of how they goes into like cables and how there are choke points where the internet from various companies can enter China. Now, so they want to control the internet, have an exclusive Chinese internet. To me, one of the big disadvantages of that is you don't get feedback from your citizens. Now, feedback can take the form of protests and demonstrations like in Hong Kong, or even what we have in New Zealand, talkback radio. People ring up and talk on the issue of the day. So how damaging or negative for the Chinese system of government do you think is the fact that there isn't this feedback from citizens on whatever issues are coming up? For example, one would be COVID-19.
I mean, it certainly does have negative consequences in terms of government feedback, and it's got much worse under Xi Jinping because the censorship has become a lot stricter, and the requirements for sort of ideological conformity, and even the news media are much stricter. However, the Chinese government spends a fortune on public opinion monitoring, that they call it, and that includes examination of what's going on the internet. It includes doing surveys. It includes monitoring, what they used to call mass incidents, like demonstrations and things, which do in fact go on. It's also worth saying that there's no Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, etc. Western social media and most news media are blocked by China's Great Firewall, so you can't get them. But the Chinese social media is very, very active. There are two main social media platforms. The one is called Weibo, and it's basically like more or less like Twitter, Facebook kind of thing. And it has very, very active comments. And anytime there is something going on in China, people will comment on it. Now, they'll censor it immediately, but that data is available to the government. So they are getting feedback from that.
Like the restaurant incident.
With the woman that was beaten up in Tangshan, yeah, exactly. That, but also other things like even say COVID-19. I mean, they may be deleting the comments immediately, but the government can see what people put up. The other channel is Wechat, which is something like WhatsApp, but it does all kinds of things. But it's not publicly searchable what people are doing. but it doesn't have to be publicly searchable for the government to figure out what's doing. And that's also very closely monitored. If you post stuff in an internal Wechat group that the government doesn't like, they can, they sometimes will shut down your account or suspend you for a period of time. But again, this means the government also has access to all of those comments. So it's not as damaging as you might think.
Thank you. Could I just before we go to the next question, I should have said right at the start that we are videoing and recording this conversation in the hope that we can turn it into a podcast or a video on YouTube for watching in the future.
So that the Chinese government can figure out.
So Jeremy's aware of this and he's speaking very much on the public record. If you ask a question and you would rather that your voice, for example, is not in the recording, please talk to us at the end and we'll make sure that's fine.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Jeremy, you talked about perhaps the nationalism involved in looking back at the history, particularly to do with the century of humiliation. How significant is that, going into the future in terms of how perhaps future leaders or future officers or bureaucrats might react to certain situations at the international level where there is, say, confrontation?
I think it's really, really, really important and significant. I think it explains a lot of China's prickliness when it comes to, many different things. Its behavior, in the South China Sea, on the one hand, but also it's hypersensitive to criticism, particularly from the Anglophone world. And the desire to be respected and to never have to endure the century of humiliation again is a fundamental drive of the Communist Party and the Chinese government's behavior. And it's also something that has tremendous popular support. And I think, as I said, this has been propagandized and the party does like to kind of nurse the wound so that people remember. But even without that, it would be there. This is something that, any Chinese person who knows any history at all is aware of and sensitive about. And, as I also said, with justification. So yeah, important.
How vulnerable is China? Because we've got a zero COVID policy, which essentially means cities get shut down every time someone gets a sniffle. And you could see, for example, Western companies that have used China as their factory for the last few decades deciding, well, we can't do business with China anymore because it's just too much of a risk that our factories will have to shut down every few weeks, and they relocate. So is that a potential vulnerability for China that Western businesses decide to up sticks and leaving the Chinese economy in a less than ideal spot?
It is, I think, a problem. China's, every day becomes less and less dependent on Western companies. And another part of the current sort of government policies is a drive for to reduce dependency on the outside world. And the one thing they're really dependent on, aside from resources, is chips. That's really the last piece of technology that they can't make themselves, and they're trying very hard to reduce that dependency. But it's a danger even within China. The economic growth this year is, by Chinese standards, very, very slow. It's down to 4% or something, which sounds good, but not really great for China. It's also, I think, a problem in the sense that, the people I know in Shanghai, I have a lot of friends in Shanghai who are enjoying their beautiful lives and have been for, the last years, and they don't really care about politics. They're making money, they're driving around in flashy cars, and, they can order gourmet ice cream on their app and it arrives in 5 minutes, and, this kind of thing. It's Shanghai, you can have a really great life, but you've been locked in your apartment for 2 months and, with literally not enough food. Some of these people are, for the first time ever, in my experience, being disillusioned by the Chinese system. And I think it is, the difficulty of figuring out how to, transition out of COVID zero, because it is so closely associated with Xi Jinping, does point to a vulnerability of the authoritarian system, and I think, authoritarian countries, they look very stable until one day suddenly they aren't, and, you could see, I think there's always the possibility that something will go terribly wrong in China, and the rigidity, the censorship is one aspect, COVID zero is another thing. The rigidity of the system is a danger, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
So first thing is, I just wonder how the overturning of Roe v. Wade is being seen in China, in terms of how the media reports on it, or how the ordinary Chinese person thinks of it. And secondly, I just wonder, in respect to how you mentioned how China, social conservatism, basically of Xi Jinping particularly, and how they're cracking down on, say, cis men, and they're cracking down on LGBT groups and NGOs. And from the way I understand, the Chinese youth are nationalistic, but they're socially progressive. So there's a contradiction in that. So how are the Chinese youth viewing these crackdown and the increasing social conservatism of the CCP?
That's a great question. I mean, Roe v. Wade is, we've done a few articles on it. You see quite a broad spectrum of reactions to it. There's some that approve, I think a minority. I mean, it's always difficult to get a handle on numbers of this kind of thing because of censorship. But there are certainly people who think that it's good, social conservatives. There's plenty of reaction that's, look at America is going completely crazy. There are people making comparisons with China's one-child policy. So it's quite a mixed bag, I would say. The one-child policy is sort of interesting because that's changing. China has a demographic time bomb essentially, and the government is worried it's going to get old before it gets rich, and they're trying to reverse the decline in population, and they're having a great deal of difficulty because young Chinese people don't want to have a lot of kids. Many don't want to have any kids because it's stressful and very expensive. The schooling system is incredibly competitive. Almost all young Chinese people are only children themselves, so that's the social norm now. And as a result of this, it has, in fact, in some areas become much more difficult to get an abortion, whereas before, you could get an abortion very, very easily, and in fact, obviously it was encouraged because everybody was only supposed to have one kid. So, I think the reactions have been all over the place in terms of Roe v. Wade. The question about social conservatism from the government and the more sort of socially progressive youth, I think that is a real tension in society at the moment. I don't get the sense that it's big enough of a problem that there's going to be, mass demonstrations or anything like that. And I think, one can underestimate the ability of the Chinese people to endure whatever comes from the government. People are very used to being told what to do, and generally speaking are able to just get on with it as long as they don't feel that their own children are threatened. I think that's perhaps the one area where you can see real popular anger explode. I'm thinking, say, of in 2008 there was this scandal when milk was found to have melamine in it, and some babies died, and that's the type of issue that I think is probably most dangerous for the government. I think crackdowns on LGBTQ groups and stuff, people seem to be coping. I would say also, just one last thing on that, is that, say, in the case of LGBTQ groups, the government doesn't really care what you do behind closed doors. They just don't want you to go on the streets, and they don't want you to politically organize. So there have been crackdowns on internet groups. The Shanghai Pride March has been cancelled now, but they're not actually going after people's private behavior, and I think that buys them a lot of room with the youth.
The population of China is perhaps not as homogenous as we might think, and the Communist Party not as monolithic. It's a bit of a speculative question, but what happens after Xi?
After Xi Jinping?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, maybe they're going to keep him alive forever. They've got great problems. That's a great question. I mean, and that I think also points to like the problem with the system, the rigidity. Is he hasn't, to anyone's knowledge, groomed any kind of successor. And if he just had a heart attack and died tomorrow, nobody knows what would happen. And even if it's not something quite so dramatic, it's very difficult to know right now. One assumes that at some point he's going to start thinking about it, but maybe not. Maybe he'll be so, sort of power drunk by that point. He's just going to be, like Chairman Mao. He's going to hang on until his, last breath. I don't know, and I think that's a problem for China.
Hi Jeremy, I've got a two-pronged question. My first question is, how long do you think New Zealand can use trade alliances with China to compensate for a military alliance? And the second part is, do you think China is condoning with Russia its invasion of Ukraine to have the prospect for China to try to expand its trade and military connections with Russia's partners in Eastern Europe?
How long can New Zealand continue to use trade alliances with China rather than military alliances with America, you mean?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really know how to answer that, actually. I think that, currently I think New Zealand is actually doing a pretty good job of balancing. I think for all people moaning about various things about Jacinda, she seems to me to be, sort of threading the needle, walking the tightrope rather effectively. I mean, the government hasn't alienated China, which I think would be a bad idea. They are starting to sort of speak up for democratic values, but without doing it in such a way that doesn't seem too disrespectful for China. So, I think you might be able to continue down this path for a very long time. But everything could change depending on who's in charge, right? And the trouble with China is that it's not just who's in charge. Like the example of the Nobel Peace Prize going to Liu Xiaobo. I mean, that wasn't the Norwegian government, but they paid the price, and the Norwegian economy paid the price. And I could see something similar happening here. The second question was.
Do you see the prospect for China to try to expand its military or trade alliances with Russia's partners in Eastern Europe?
With Russia? Well, they just before the invasion, Putin was in Beijing for the Winter Olympics, and the official statements that came out of China was that the Russian-China friendship had no limits. Was the word they used, and this was just before the invasion. So they're pretty strong already. They've been getting stronger over the last few years. They don't actually have a military alliance. They buy weapons from Russia. I don't think Beijing trusts Moscow as far as it can spit, but I think it sees it as a very useful ideological friend, and I think both. Putin and Xi see the West in a very similar way, they haven't been willing to say even a peep of criticism about Ukraine, despite the fact that non-interference in other countries is a core tenet of their foreign policy. I think you'll just see more of the same.
Thank you very much. I noticed on that synopsis you're doing of the various dynasties that they tended to last for typically 300 to 400 years. And is there a rhythm to that? And in particular, if you take the 1912, since then we're getting close to halfway through a 300-year period. And related to that, I suppose, is you were talking about the growth rate of 4%. And I can recall sort of 10 years ago, it was seen that China really needed a growth rate of about 8% in terms of maintaining social stability. So where do you see currently the sort of correlation between growth rates and social stability?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I want to just say 2%, but I just made that up. I really don't know. I think that it's the China that I knew, from 95 to 2015, pretty much grew at 8%, 8.3%, whatever. The whole time it was 8%, and everybody around me, the standard of living improved every day. Not every day, but it felt like every day. And this includes, rural peasant farmers, and includes, university-educated urban elites, and it certainly is responsible for, I think, Chinese people being, often surveys of opinion, they're among the most optimistic people about the future. And I think this is part of it. And it's definitely a huge part of the reason for the tremendous levels of support the Communist Party does, in fact, enjoy. So I don't, I think, the question is right in the sense that there must be a level of slowdown at which you would start to see problems with social stability. I have no idea what that number is. I think the growth rate, just to end on this thought, that China's much richer now than it was. So I don't think it needs to grow as fast as it used to, in the 70s and 80s, there was this concept of the San Da Jian, like the three big items, which were, what was it, a fridge, a bicycle, and a TV. And if you had those things, you were set, Whereas now, everybody who has, a penny to rub together has a car. It is kind of like a car in every garage and a chicken in every oven, in a way, the society. So, if it slows down and they can maintain that level of prosperity, maybe that's not actually going to be a huge problem.
Part of it seemed to be that there was the rate at which sort of social mobility from the rural areas coming into the urbanisation of the population, which was causing an uplift. Do you see that continuing or changing?
Well, the policies have changed a bit. China hit 50% urbanization. I don't remember exactly when, it was a few years ago, and I think they've decided that's enough. And the current policy is actually to try and make the countryside more prosperous again. I think that is to do with the fact that urbanization has sort of reached the limits of possibility, both in terms of just the size of the cities, but also as a means of stimulating economic growth.
Can I ask a question? Just regarding sanctions, we've seen the situation with Russia, how they brought in the sanctions against the elite and ruling wealthy class. Is the same perspective going to work to say in the case of China, in terms of their elite, the wealthy, the connected, in regards to if sanctions were brought down on their individual wealth, in that, say the case of New Zealand, where a lot of property portfolios and businesses they have interests in, where through their Irish shelf companies the money ends up in the Jersey bank. If there were sanctions were brought on the individual level, from a Chinese perspective, would that override the ideology of the whole system, being in terms of self-interest on their part, if there were sanctions brought on that individual basis?
I guess what's different perhaps is the wealthy of China are, they may have close ties to the government, but it's somewhat different, I think. If you think of the Russian oligarchs, there are people who have very close ties to Putin, whereas the wealthiest Chinese are entrepreneurs who may have good ties to the government, but they're not like Putin, they're not like Xi Jinping's buddies. So I think that's a little bit different. I also think the Chinese government, they're quite, they've seen the sanctions, they're quite worried about similar types of things. And one of the things they're doing, and have been for some time, but I think the Russian sanctions have accelerated the desire to do this, is to get out of the sort of dollar-dominated system and set up alternatives to like the SWIFT system for international money transfers. So, I mean, I think they're thinking about that, but yeah, I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yeah. It's
Sort of.
just interesting to see what level of Chinese Communist Party members have interests in New Zealand.
Right.
Yeah.
And how?
much they will influence their trade behaviours in terms of their own self-interests of their own business and property development.
I think that the Chinese government would react very strongly to sanctions applied on individuals because of politics in China, and they would not like that, and they would be supportive of the individuals, of the Chinese citizens involved, and very hostile to, like, say, New Zealand if it tried to take away people's...
Special sanctions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm just wondering if you can say something about the environmental impact of some of the Chinese projects, both nationally and internationally, in the past few years, and what the attitude of the current Chinese government is to the environment.
I think until roughly 2010, the government's attitude was we need growth, and that's the only priority. And I think that started to change around 2010, and I think the strongest factor in that, to be honest, was actually just the terrible air quality in Beijing. And when you have to live in the crazy bad air, we used to call it, because the American embassy had put an air quality monitor on top of their building, and then it would tweet every hour the air quality. And one day it went technically beyond index, but the guy who programmed it had written crazy bad. And so I tweeted the crazy bad. So that became like, those of us living in Beijing, that was what we used to call crazy bad air, was above 500 PMI. Yeah. And for a few years that was a regular occurrence. I think that was, there were other factors too. I think it's a much more science-based government than, say, we have in my adoptive country of America. And so I think, nobody denies climate change in China, nobody with any say in anything. So they've realized that it's a problem, and they're starting to do things about it. Some of the things they've done is like the Belt and Road Initiative, which people were worrying they were going to export their pollution by setting up, coal-based power plants aboard. They've made regulations to stop that, so they've stopped investing in coal-fired power abroad. But they are held back by the continued need for economic growth. China is still very dependent on fossil fuels. But on the other hand, they're also the world's biggest. They control the electric vehicle and battery supply chain, from mines to battery production. And it's also the world's leading producer of solar panels, and now the leading producer of wind energy. So, they're trying, they're aware, but they're only going to do it at their own speed. And it's not probably the speed with which, say, people in New Zealand might want to see.
We might have time for one more. I know someone's been waiting over the back.
I was going to ask a question about the way in which values are being used to kind of frame the relationship between China and the West. The way in which the West is using democratic values or human rights values to coalesce as an alliance almost, framed against that. And my question is really, is that strategy of framing the relationship going to work, or is it going to be alienating and perhaps received hostilely from a Chinese perspective? So from a government perspective, they were already bristling at the suggestion of values, but what about an average Chinese person's perspective, who actually may be aligned on other values dimensions with us. Take guns for example, where we may not be as tightly aligned on a values basis with the US as we might be with China. So values as a framing, is that going to endure?
I don't think it's I don't think the Chinese government especially, but ordinary Chinese people are tremendously receptive to the West giving them especially what is perceived as lectures about human rights and values. And the entire global South. I mean, you just haven't, even about Ukraine, you haven't seen any global South countries react like the Anglophone and the Western countries have to that. And if you're sitting in Baghdad or Kabul, I don't think you really take America very seriously when it complains about China's human rights record. So I think that values are a way that Western countries sort of can align themselves. But I don't think it's, and I'm not saying they're not important or that China doesn't commit human rights abuses, but I don't think it's an issue that could divide the Chinese people from their government in the abstract. I think in the but when you are a young Ferrari driving, gourmet ice cream eating Shanghainese who's been locked up in your apartment for 2 months because you essentially have no free speech and no right to organize politically in China, then maybe you start to see it differently. But when it's in the abstract, when you're the Shanghainese Ferrari driving a Ferrari and you're told that China's bad because they're locking up Uyghurs, I don't think that's got any appeal at all.
Let me reframe it. Is it dangerous for New Zealand to frame its relationship that way?
I don't know. I think it has to be done with a great deal of care because, the Chinese kind of response that about the hypocrisy of the West. I mean, there's a lot of truth there. In some ways, it's pretty cheeky of the Western world to lecture China about human rights, considering our record. So I don't think it's not necessarily dangerous, but I think it's something that has to be approached with sensitivity.
Can we call on Jodie? You'd like to part of our committee of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy and Alistair, for presenting to us this afternoon. It's certainly been a very informative, very interesting presentation on China. I know, Jeremy, at the very beginning you said that in your history section it was a crude summary of some complicated things. I'd like to think of it more as a high-level summary of Chinese history. Certainly it would probably take many days, many weeks to cover that topic alone. Certainly in the coming years, as China becomes a bigger part of the New Zealand foreign experience, it's certainly helpful to know what China's thinking, how they approach the world and so on. So I just ask the audience to thank our speakers in the usual manner.